We're going to explore the astounding story of Dorothy Eady, an Englishwoman who believed she had a previous life in the 13th century BC. She had been a girl who had been left to be raised at the Temple of Sety at Abydos in Egypt when she was 3 years old by her soldier father, her mother having died. At 14, she became a vowed priestess of Isis and first encountered the powerful warrior pharaoh Sety I in the garden of his newly built temple. The pharaoh from a ruling family and the off-limits virgin priestess fell tragically in love. When she discovered she was pregnant, rather than reveal her secret, she committed suicide. Sety was devastated. 3,300 years later, Sety found his temple priestess. She was in a child named Dorothy Eady living in the early 20th century England. Soon, Sety would take her through the mist, star-walking along the astral highway to Amenti, the hidden realm, where she encountered him not as a phantom, but as a man. Their love affair resumed. When they weren't making love, they were talking about ancient Egypt. As an adult, Dorothy moved to Egypt, becoming an accomplished and widely acknowledged scholar known for an uncanny knowledge of ancient Abydos. She was given the name Omm Sety. When the search for Omm Sety, a story of eternal love, was first told in 1987 by Jonathan Cott in collaboration with Dr. Hani El-Zani, Omm Sety's long-term friend, it received high praise from everyone from Yoko Ono to Carl Sagan. The book acknowledges Jackie Onassis as one of its editorial guardian spirits. It brought up intriguing mysteries of magic, perception, memory, and reincarnation. And in the intervening years, there's been talk of secret diaries of Omm Sety, of lost knowledge about Abydos not revealed in Jonathan Cott's book. Today, those revelations have been masterfully presented in Omm Sety's Egypt by Catherine Dees in collaboration with Hani El-Zani. Catherine is a California writer and editor with an abiding love for Egypt and its brilliant, still unfolding legacy. A longtime student of human consciousness and the lost history and wisdom of the ancient world, she was also the co-producer of the exhibit Continuum, the Immortality Principle, and historian for the Alexandria Project, a search for the tomb of Alexander the Great and the lost Alexandrian Library. Catherine is a member of the American Research Center in Egypt and the Egyptian Exploration Organization and is a sponsor of the Amarna Royal Tombs Project in the Valley of the Kings. Catherine Dees, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you. I'm just delighted to be here and speak about Omm Sety.
Well, I can't remember the last time I was so fired up about a book. I read it, and I've lost 2 days at the Vanderbilt University Divinity Library in their Egypt section. Just got to go back there and feel that vibe of Abydos. You brought it to life so incredibly well.
You're very kind. I felt almost as if I were in another realm as I was working with the manuscript.
It's mesmerizing, just the all of the story elements, but when it's put together the way you did, it just is such a wonderful read, and I highly encourage everybody to get a hold of this book. Let's first, for a moment, if you wouldn't mind, about your collaborator, Hani El-Zani. Tell us about Hani and how you came to collaborate with him on this project.
Well, Hani, I really hesitate to call him Dr. El-Zani, which is his proper name. He's a very comfortable gentleman. So we'll call him Hani for the interview.
Okay.
He was an industrial chemist, and he was named president of the Egyptian Sugar and Distillery Company in 1956, which was the largest on the African continent. The company had been previously owned by a consortium of European countries until Nasser nationalized Egypt's major industries. So Hani was the first native Egyptian to head one of the greatest industries in all of Egypt. So a quite competent man, a scientist, a person who looks at things with a cool eye, and a man of huge responsibilities. The headquarters of the company happened to be at Nag Hammadi, which was just a hop and a skip away from Abydos. And over Hani's life, he had been fascinated by the history of Egypt, and he had hung out as a child at the excavations wherever he found them. So when he found himself close to Abydos, it was almost like a dream come true, because he knew about some of the great ruins there, especially the Temple of Sety. And one day, shortly after he set up shop in Nag Hammadi as the president of this enormous conglomerate, he took a little breather and went over to Abydos, and there he encountered the most unusual woman he had ever met, a blonde, outspoken, clever English woman who apparently was living a life as a peasant woman in the village of Abydos. Everything about her was strange. But the most marvelous thing, the thing that brought the two of them together, was her great knowledge of ancient Egypt and of the temple. Knowledge that went so far beyond what could be known at the time. She seemed to have a direct line to the past. The two of them became fast friends. Now that's how they met. They became friends, and he became her confidant and, in a way, her protector for the next 25 years that she lived. I met him at a dinner party in Cairo years later, right after Jonathan Cott's book, The Search for Omm Sety, had come out. I had read the book and was absolutely charmed by this love story, and just the whole possibility of reincarnation and out-of-body travel and all the things that her story involves. And the hostess made a beeline for me that evening and said, "There's someone you must meet." I hadn't told her a thing about my interest in Omm Sety. She brought me to Dr. El-Zany and said, "I think you two have a lot to talk about." Just one of those aha moments. So here I was, talking with the man who had collaborated with Jonathan Cott on that first book. And we ended up having dinner together, and we were sitting at a table with a group of Egyptologists talking about Omm Sety. And they said that they would take Omm Sety's word for where something could be found underneath the sands over any mechanical probes out there. The Japanese had just been doing some work in the Great Pyramid looking for hidden chambers, and they had brought the state-of-the-art machines. And at that time, I don't think they found anything. So everybody was wishing that Omm Sety had been around because she would probably be able to see just what was there. The next day, I was invited to have tea with the El-Zanys. I went to their apartment in Cairo, and one of the highlights, the electrifying moments of that interview was when he put on a tape recorder, a recording of a conversation he had with his old friend years earlier. And I heard this vivid, British, confident voice saying, "I know where the tomb of Nefertiti lies, and someday I'll tell you before I die." And then he turned the tape off. And I said, "Did she tell you? Did she ever tell you?" And he said, "Oh, yes, that and much more."
Wow.
Well, I was hooked. Hanny and I became good friends. We corresponded for a number of years about questions of ancient Egypt, questions I had. I'm a writer, and I was working on a time travel novel back to ancient Egypt, so I was really keen to know what I could. And Henny was quite an accomplished amateur Egyptologist with a great number of friends who were the famous names that we read about in Egyptology. So I guess that's maybe a few more words than you needed to hear, but that's how I met him.
No, that's great. And because what I want to get into just in the couple moments we have here before the break is establishing for our listeners a little bit of a timeline, Catherine. At age 3, Dorothy fell down the stairs and was knocked unconscious. What happened after this pivotal moment?
She appeared to die. The doctor was called for. He pronounced her dead after an examination, and he went back to his office to prepare the death certificate. When he returned about an hour later, he found a little girl who had some bruises on her, but she was bouncing in her bed, and she was saying, "I want to go home now." And she wasn't talking about her London apartment. She was talking about new images, new memories that had suddenly come into her little head. She didn't know how to describe them because she was only 3 and she had never seen a temple. But that's what was in her mind. And a year later, her parents took her to the British Museum. And as soon as they walked into the Egyptian galleries, the little girl, Dorothy, just fell apart. She ran around hugging all the statues, and her parents were terribly embarrassed because the child was making a scene, and this was not the kind of place where you make a scene. They pried her away and took her home. Oh, pardon me for that. They took her home. She continued to insist that these were her people, and she wanted to stay there with them. Very, very perplexing to the parents who had never encountered such a peculiar child. Later, about age 6, her father brought home a series of National Geographic books, and one of them had a photograph of the Seti Temple in Egypt at Abydos, and it was shown in its ruined state at the time. And the little girl Dorothy burst into tears because she said, "It's all ruined. They've
Wow.
heard it, and it was her place. She recognized it."
Mm-hmm.
And among those National Geographic pictures was a picture of the mummy of Seti the First,
Mm-hmm.
and she knew him. And that was the first time that everything started coming together and really clicking. She belonged in Abydos. And
She belonged in Abydos. Catherine, we're going to take a short break, and when we get back, we want to follow again the timeline of what happened when she met Sir Wally Budge, Dr. Wally Budge, and how he proclaimed her his miracle child. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Catherine Dees. Catherine, tales of reincarnation are very difficult to prove, but in the case of Dorothy Eady, she had some of the most acknowledged scholars, Egyptologists of their time, looking at her and thinking, well, maybe, just maybe. Who were some of these pivotal people that came into her life, and how did they guide her on her quest to learn the secrets of ancient Egypt?
When she was 10, she was fond of playing hooky because she wanted to spend her time in the museum. And one day, the great Egyptologist of the time, Sir Wallace Budge, noticed that this girl was there and not in school. And he came up to her and he said, "Pardon me, child, why aren't you in school?" And she said, "Because they don't teach me anything I want to learn." And he replied, "Oh, and what is it you want to learn?" And she burst out and said, "Hieroglyphs." That was the beginning of a most unusual student-teacher relationship.
Mm-hmm.
She became his student at the age of 10. He would give her portions of the pyramid texts, the great magical texts, the most ancient ones in all Egypt, and have her transcribe them, have her copy them, and then transcribe them into English. And she ended up copying all of the great magical formulas of the pyramid texts. She said it was so easy for her because she wasn't learning hieroglyphs, she was remembering something that she had forgotten. So here was this little child frantically furnishing her modern day brain with the knowledge that she had had before and creating, I think, all those new brain synapses to be able to handle it. She stayed with Dr. Budge off and on through a number of years until finally she left for Egypt when she was 30.
And he really seemed to miss her, because when he went to Egypt later in his life, he wondered what happened to Dorothy. But before we get into that part of her life, Catherine, let's talk about what happened when she had a visitor in her room who she described whose eyes had the look of somebody in hell who had suddenly found a way out. Talk about that experience and how it changed her.
Well, we know that she responded very strongly to that photograph of Seti. And if anybody has seen it, it is a beautiful face, as beautiful as a mummified face can be. It's
very elegant,
elegant looking man. She was 14 years old. She was visiting at her grandmother's farm in Sussex and was awakened suddenly in the middle of the night by somebody standing over her. And it was a mummified form. And the only thing that showed was the head. And the face looked anguished, and it was staring at her. And it reached out toward her. And she called out just because it was so surprising and shocking. And yet she said she wasn't afraid. She knew that this was the one. And but she had called out, and it brought her mother running into the room. And so she had to quickly cover up what had happened. By then, the apparition had vanished. And she said, "Oh, no, it was just a nightmare." And the mother looked at her nightgown and said, "Well, who tore your nightgown?" Well, when the apparition had reached toward her, he had tried to clutch onto her, and he had pulled away some of her nightgown. She said, "Oh, no, I did it myself." She never forgot that experience, and she wasn't afraid. For years after that, once she became an adult, she went to psychics to find out what it was and if she could ever get back in contact with him. She knew it was Seti. She knew she loved him, and she would never love anyone the way she loved him. And some of the psychics said, "Oh, no, that was just a devilish, it was a negative energy coming after you." But she knew it wasn't. She felt the love, which was cloaked in a kind of anguish, and she didn't know why. That was the great experience that keyed her toward going to Egypt at all costs.
And when she finally got to Egypt, she decided to stay there. In fact, she became the first woman to be hired by the Egyptian Antiquities Department. Talk for a moment about that phase of her life.
Yes. She did marry, by the way, just before we talk about her work with the Antiquities Department. She fell in love to some extent, I would say, with an Egyptian exchange student, a graduate student in education who was in London at the same time as she was. And they were both very much involved in the Egyptian nationalism movement, because the British had pretty much colonized Egypt for a long time. Mm-hmm. So the students were agitating for home rule. And Omm Sety, of course, was a very eager agitator herself,
a rebel.
Loving Egypt as she did. Mm-hmm. And so she met this young man, and he fell just crazy in love with her. And she responded enough to agree to marry him. And in the back of her mind, she probably knew that there was no way she was ever going to live out this fantasy that she had.
Yeah,
and she should get on with her life. Mm-hmm. And it would also take her to Egypt. So they went to Egypt. She did not fit in terribly well with his very conventional upper middle class family, who loved her but found her ways so eccentric that it was a little difficult. And she had a baby. And what do you imagine that she named this little boy but Seti? Mm-hmm. Much to the alarm of the family. She convinced them that it was a fine old Egyptian name of a pharaoh, and so finally they said fine.
But they worried, didn't they, that they might think that this child, that the locals might think, "Hey, who do you think you are with a name like Seti? That's a pharaoh's name."
Oh, yes. Not only that, but if you say it in a certain way, it also sounds like you're calling him a girl. And they just didn't want to set up this poor little baby for ridicule. Right. But Omm Sety herself, or Dorothy at the time, was quite adamant, and everybody capitulated, and Dorothy was a charmingly convincing young woman. But the marriage couldn't last. It was too strange. She was starting to have visitations of another kind in the night, and from an old priest, apparently, who dictated to her an almost incredible story of a young girl in an ancient time who became the priestess of Isis at the Seti temple. She was being told the story of her previous life. Anyway, all of this caused great stress on the marriage, and they divorced. And she went to live next to the pyramids and the Sphinx. And
sleeping underneath gateways, literally out under the stars, had such a desire to be out in the open spaces. And
she did. She was not a modern woman. She didn't like sleeping inside. She scandalized her ex-husband and his parents by taking the baby with her to sleep in old tombs. She saw no problem with this, but of course it was just not to be done. After a while, the family suggested that the baby would be better raised in a more conventional setting. And that's what happened, and she knew she wasn't the best possible mother for this little child. But by now, she was working with the famous Salim Hassan, excavating at the pyramids, and learning Egyptology, learning archaeology. She had a brain that just absorbed all of this knowledge. And she was also having some unusual visitations in her little house by the Sphinx. There's a story, I don't know how many stories I should tell, but there's a story of one night during World War II, when there were bombs falling in Cairo, and everybody was afraid that the museum would be bombed and other great monuments. One night she went to sleep, and when she awoke, she had something in her hand. She opened her hand, and it was a silver amulet in the shape of the god Osiris. Mm-hmm. It just was in her hand. She took it to a jeweler and had it made into something to hang around her neck, and it was soldered onto the chain. She wore that all the way through the war, and as soon as the war stopped, she woke up one morning, and the chain was still around her neck, but the amulet was gone. And it didn't appear to have fallen off. It had been welded to the chain, or whatever they do, the jewelers do. It just had vanished. Things like this happened to Omm Sety.
Incredible. Catherine, we have to catch another quick break here, but when we get back, let's talk about the relationship as it developed with these two incredible people. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Catherine Dees. Catherine, in the book, you described the appearance of Seti after a long absence. Quote, you write, "One night she was drawn up from sleep by a vague uneasiness, as if somebody had exhaled a long, deep breath very close to her cheek. When she opened her eyes, she saw a shimmering, amorphous something next to her bed, and a man's tall figure slowly taking form, but not quite fully materializing. She reached out to touch him, but she was stopped by an invisible barrier. He stood there in silence behind it, gazing at her. Moments later, he vanished, leaving behind an almost palpable energy." Wow, this sounds like Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus on Easter morning.
It's pretty stunning. It's pretty stunning.
Talk about
that. She was married at the time. She learned later that Seti was operating under some very strict rules. from the other side. And one of the rules was that he would not be allowed to come to her physically while she was married. She didn't know that. But he began, during her short marriage, to appear from time to time at her bed. And she never knew when he would come, but she yearned for him to come. And yet there next to her was her husband. And she loved him, and she could make love with him. She loved this man more, and she couldn't make love with him. It was a terrible situation. She was just torn because her husband was
Stop for a second. I mean, we're talking about a being, Sety, who's living in another realm, who's toggling between the worlds, but yet he's having this amazing love affair with an earthly woman. Incredible. I mean,
well, the physical aspect comes a little bit later. Sety was bound by these rules, and once the divorce happened and she went to live at the pyramids, Sety came to her as a fully materialized man, and apparently was fully materialized in every way, and they recommenced their passionate love affair.
As you describe too, Catherine, you talk about a substance that was produced by her body called sekhem, meaning the vital force. Is this the same as Kundalini, do you think?
I don't know. I've thought about this. Yeah, he was very much concerned about drawing her vital force, because it was necessary for him to be able to materialize. I think that she was a naturally a mediumistic person, and I know there are materializing mediums who can extrude ectoplasm, and forms will materialize by inhabiting the ectoplasm. Who knows what was really going on? Sekhem, though, S-E-K-H-E-M in our spelling, was the vital activating force of a person. If, for instance, a dark magician were wanting to completely debilitate somebody, that magician in ancient Egypt would have attached himself to the sekhem and drawn it out and left the person enfeebled. Sety knew very well that he could not come to her in a materialized form unless he asked her permission to use her sekhem. And over the years that they had this relationship, he would never come to her if she were sick or feeling weak, because he didn't want to further weaken her. Now, Tanny believed that her premature aging, she appeared to age very quickly, was a result of having been drawn on so much, even though it was completely voluntary on her part, and she would never have refused him.
Abydos itself, the temple, is one of the most amazing places a person can ever visit. The Temple of Sety is a temple of man. It's a rectangular temple, and its plan shows two eyes, a mouth, and a body mounted to another temple called the Osirion, which is shaped like an Ankh cross. And the whole temple appears to be a blueprint for some kind of a very powerful, very significant teaching. And when you go inside the temple at Abydos, you see the fabulous Osiris device, the resurrection machine that Sety would have effectively worshipped, and perhaps Omm Sety also worshipped Osiris in this form. Do we know what kind of initiatory teachings that Sety had partaken of? I mean, we see the depictions of him today wearing his transparent clothing, which symbolizes the new clothes that the initiate gets upon their resurrection in the Egyptian Book of Gates. This isn't just some kind of a dim-witted sort of warrior pharaoh we're dealing with here, the cartoon versions portrayed in Hollywood films and everything. This guy had to know a lot about toggling between the worlds, and he came back for his beloved.
Yes, indeed. He knew magic. He had learned magic, and we're talking about magic in its greatest sense, which is the ability to move the molecules of atoms to create a viable energy in a statue, so that when you come before a statue that has been imbued with this magical intention, you are receiving it. Nothing is dead in Egypt, in ancient Egypt. Everything was alive, and the magicians, the high magicians, who were the greatest priests of antiquity, knew how to work with matter, and they knew the spiritual energies. And so when they designed a temple, they designed the temple to be a spiritual transformation site.
And, a stargate.
Yes, certainly. Seti's intention, his placement of that temple in that particular place, was in response to a dream vision that he had, where Osiris came and told him that was the place to put the temple. Mm-hmm. And Abydos had long been the center, the greatest holy place of ancient Egypt, because it was the land of Osiris. It was where Osiris's body was buried, possibly just his head. There are different stories, but certainly, if you are talking about power places on Earth, Abydos has to be one of the great ones. And when Seti designed his temple, he designed it with great reverence around the even older Osirion, which has every indication of having been a great initiatory temple. And no, Seti was not your average military man.
Right.
Yes.
Catherine, we're up against another break, but when we get back, let's talk about what Omm Sety believed about the Seti Temple and how it protects a number of important ancient secrets. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Catherine Deese. Catherine, before the break, we started to talk about the secrets of Abydos and how Omm Sety believed that it protected a number of important ancient secrets. Can we talk for a moment about the nature of those secrets?
Yes. One of the secrets she literally stumbled upon. We write about it in Omm Sety's Egypt. She was staying in the temple late afternoon, one early evening, and decided to leave her temple office by way of the rooftop rather than the ordinary way that she did. And in doing so, she fell through some kind of opening that suddenly opened under her feet, and she tumbled and found herself in a dark corridor. For a moment before the stone closed behind her, she could see a little bit of illumination into the corridor, and it was filled with artifacts, temple artifacts. She saw the gleam of gold. She made her way through the new darkness, and she managed to pick up a piece of linen cloth, as she made her way out. And she was rather disoriented for a little bit because she didn't know what had happened to her or where she was, but instinctively she knew she had stumbled onto the treasure room of the temple, and that it had been a secret place, and something had happened, and she had inadvertently touched the stone that would swing apart and allow entrance. She found a way outside of this and came out into the second courtyard of the temple and was seen by one of the watchmen. And she was just covered with dust and cobwebs. And she had this cloth. Well, she talked to Seti about all of this, And he said she had indeed been in the treasury of the temple, and that there was much more there. One of the things in the treasury that he knew to be still there was the magical book written by the legendary founder of the 18th dynasty, Omm. Now, Omm was a great magician, and Sety said that Sety did not want anybody to find the book because it had too much power, and it would unleash, if in the wrong hands, it would unleash terrible things. So again, the respect for the power of magic. The other thing that was to be found in the treasury was Sety's own annals written by his own hand. No king had ever done that before that we know of. This would have been a fantastic thing to find because it would tell the story of the previous times, including Akhenaten and the Great Revolution of the overthrowing of the gods by Akhenaten and Nefertiti. There is a treasury there. We know it. Hanny has...
That's
Hanny has
just
worked with people...
Go ahead.
Oh, Hanny has worked with a couple of excavation groups looking for the treasury. There have been some problems in actually getting to it, but every indication architecturally shows that at that point that Omm Sety describes, there is an anomaly, and it would allow for a room very much the size that she found herself in. So we're hoping that there may be somebody enterprising enough down the line to make another attempt to find the treasury.
When can we leave, Catherine? I'm ready.
I'd love to go back. I'm saving my
ready.
pennies.
You walk in the Temple of Sety at Abydos, for everyone who's listening, and you're in what appears to be a technology center. You enter the Osiris Chapel, and on one wall is the incredible Osiris device that's being tended by Sety. He's offering food to it, indicating this device is an instrument to be used for peaceful purposes. We're told that this is, in fact, the ladder of Osiris, the stairway to heaven. On the opposite wall of the Osiris device is the same pillar, but now with Sety transformed into the pillar as the mast of the ship of eternity. And it so happens that that ship of eternity matches the shape that modern science uses to portray a wormhole, a Stargate device. You continue on into the rest of the Osiris Chapel there, and you see the incredible Jed pillars being raised, the backbone of Osiris, once again, the cosmic axis being established. And this is before you even get out back into the Osirion and see the incredible colossal or monolithic red granite blocks that weigh 70 and 80 tons each that were strewn around as if they're Legos. But Catherine, one of the things that Abydos is most known for in the sort of alternative community is they've heard of the famous helicopter and UFO and the tank found on the walls of Sety's temple. Experts claim this is caused by recarving, but I find it very interesting that the technology found on the walls of Sety's temple is so clearly understood now through the modern eye. Can you talk for a moment about some of the origins of this technology that we see in the Sety temple? Do you think that Sety was researching deep Egyptian antiquity and that it's possible, as is suggested by the Osirion, that what we see there is evidence of a pre-flood civilization?
Well, William, you certainly know a lot about this, probably a great deal more than I do from my own personal observations, but I am certainly open to all of this. I feel that Sety drew around himself some great priest adepts to do the architecture, to design the inscriptions on the walls. Nothing was ever put there by chance. Nothing was put there for artistic reasons only. Everything has a message, and it has meaning upon meaning. And, of course, that's the brilliance of those adept priests. They knew how to make something that would be understood by the average person and also that would act as a focal point to draw an aspiring candidate for initiation into that next level. And that's what I believe there is a great deal of inside the Seti temple in the inner chambers.
Yeah, so when you start talking about an undiscovered treasury, it's like, absolutely, it's got to be there, and the sky's the limit in terms of what could potentially be buried beneath Abydos.
Well, what could be there? Oh, my goodness, yes. My own personal feeling, and I don't know that Dr. Elzani is completely, I haven't really talked much with him about this, but my gut feeling is that Osiris left his energy there in some physical or non-corporeal way. It is a focal point. He is Egypt. There is a destiny for Egypt that hasn't been played out yet, and I believe in my own personal thoughts that Egypt was the way station for Atlantean high priests and adepts, and that they were the ones who built the Great Pyramid.
Can't say that in Egypt, though, Catherine. Don't let the Egyptian antiquities people catch you talking like that.
That's right. Now you've got Zahi Hawass, who really wants to demythologize all of this stuff and make Egyptian studies much more scientific. But
yet his closest friends and people well-sourced that I know him well tell us that he believes he's the reincarnated Khufu. So
that's
these people
correct.
They seem to be playing both sides of the fence here, talking out of both sides of their mouth, and nothing's getting done.
Well, there are a lot of things that come out in private parties when you have a little wine in you to your close friends, but this is also a matter of politics.
Yeah.
You just can't stray too far from the straight doctrine.
But, you know, I just decided I'm just going to speak my truth. This is it. If they want to call me racist or bigoted because I don't believe the Egyptians built the pyramids and that that Seti built the temple at Abydos because he knew it was about the Osirian and what's actually there. I just am like you. I know it deep inside that that's what's going on at that place. And again, I just have to ask this. You know, I've injected the word Stargate and wormhole in that. Have you caught on to the Stargate TV series and their use of Abydos and some of the Egyptian?
No, I haven't, but boy, will I now.
Yeah, it's all over the place, and they're misusing it in some cases. I feel. I mean, I don't watch the show in detail, but I've read some of the articles about it and how they're using Abydos as one of their place names and are in fact talking about the Stargates and that sort of thing, which is what we have to be talking about here. When you're talking about a guy who can materialize and dematerialize into this realm and can even take a human into that realm, we're talking about the gates of the gods. And in fact, Abydos itself was known as the gate to the underworld.
Yes.
But, Catherine, when we get back from the break, I want to shift gears just a little bit and get back to that statement, that incredible statement that Omm Sety had made to Zani about the tomb of Nefertiti. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We'll be right back. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. We're continuing with Catherine Dees. Catherine, you have some just amazing chapters in your book about the possibility of Omm Sety knowing about the location of Nefertiti's tomb. Let's talk about that and why it would be so important to discover that tomb.
Nefertiti was the beautiful one. That's part of her name means the beautiful one. And she was the wife of Akhenaten, and I think many people know the story of Akhenaten, who overthrew the pantheon of gods and installed the one god that was the Aten, the disk of the sun. And Akhenaten set himself up as the only son of the great god and lived a life of mystical writing and neglect of the empire. And as a result, the empire started to fray and lose its power, and the vast complex of temples all around Egypt lost their endowments. The priesthoods were kicked out, and only the Aten was to be worshipped. Nobody knows really what the doctrine was made of that caused this new religion. Nobody knows the politics that caused Akhenaten to die, perhaps by another hand. And what happened in those years? Well, Nefertiti was the linchpin here. She was a very powerful, brilliant woman. Stories are that she went away, she left Akhenaten and went back to the old worship. Nobody knows. And why would she go back to the old worship? Were there things written that we could find someday that describe this tumultuous time that almost tore apart Egypt and its culture? If we could find Nefertiti's tomb, we might find, and this Dr. El-Zany believes this, and many Egyptologists do, we might find important documents that shed light on one of the strangest moments in ancient Egypt's history. For years and years, until just recently, the common thought was that her tomb was at Akhenaten's city of the sun, quite a distance away from the Valley of the Kings. Nobody expected Nefertiti to be buried in the Valley of the Kings, because that would have meant that she accepted the old religion of Amun. About 35 years ago, Omm Sety made that recording with my friend Hanny, and she said she knew where the tomb of Nefertiti could be found. Mm-hmm. She described it pretty
darn carefully. This is information she got from Sety, too, isn't it?
She got this from Sety. Now, Sety did not want the tomb to be found, and he mm-hmm. said, why are you asking? And Sety came along shortly after the terrible, confused period of Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and he charged himself with the task of reestablishing Egypt, reestablishing the gods, bringing the empire back, mm-hmm. And he was the brilliant man who could do it. He didn't want anything more spoken about that criminal, as he called Akhenaten. And so he certainly didn't want Nefertiti's tomb to be found, and possibly for another reason, that there would be records contained in it that he didn't want known. So he told Omm Sety during one of their nighttime sessions together where the tomb could be found, and she told Hanny. It turns out that the location is exactly where the Amarna Royal Tombs Project has been searching for the last several years, not knowing that Omm Sety had already said where it could be found.
Right.
And the tomb project happened because of its own serendipity and, mm-hmm. and odd accidents that led them to a particular place that was just adjacent to King Tut's tomb.
Right, because Omm Sety had said it's going to be found in a totally unexpected place, too, right?
Right. Nobody had a clue. They would have thought you were nuts to say that mm-hmm. you should be looking in the Valley of the Kings. The latest discoveries, just last August, of tomb 50, no, oh goodness, the numbers, tomb 63, I think is, mm-hmm. No, it's Otto Schaden.
Yeah, from the University of Memphis here in Tennessee.
Yes, and I forget the number of the tomb. KV.
You're right, it's 63.
63. Mm-hmm. They unearthed, and it's right next to King Tut's tomb, he stumbled on another serendipitous thing. He stumbled on to what appears to be a storeroom for mummy materials, mummification, the kind of storeroom that would be next to an important tomb.
Mm-hmm.
So the next thing is to go adjacent to that storeroom and see if what Omm Sety saw or knew and what the Amarna Royal Tombs Project had suspected is true. There is a priest's seal at the closed door of this next chamber, showing that it does contain a tomb of some kind. So the possibility is that Nefertiti is waiting, and a great storehouse of knowledge is waiting. Let's hope.
They talk about it possibly being even more phenomenal and fantastic than even King Tut's tomb.
Oh, yes, because King Tut's tomb, while it contained all kinds of magnificent things, it was a bit of a jumble. It contained things from other people's tombs. It wasn't a dedicated Tut tomb, and Tut, for his own life, was not a significant king.
Right.
So, and then there were not documents there. It was just that it was so fabulously beautiful. Well, why not Nefertiti's tomb? She, the beautiful one. Why not discover that and find fabulously beautiful gold and documents that tell us secrets that we'd dreamed of?
Okay, you're going to have to stop now. I'm starting to come out of my skin just thinking about it. So, one final question, Catherine. Do you think Omm Sety is with Sety now?
Oh, I do. I think she made a beeline for Sety. Absolutely. And they're probably living in his palace in Amenti. And she's having a good time with little Ramses, Seti's son. A fellow she thought was pretty delightful, even though...
And her cats are with her, too, aren't they?
Oh, she's got her cats, you bet. I wouldn't doubt it. And Sety said that it would be all right if she brought her cats. He was not terribly tolerant about cats, but if she insisted, she could bring her cats.
Yeah,
he preferred lions, actually.
Wow. Well, it's been truly phenomenal talking with you, Catherine. Is there anything else you wanted to add before we go?
Oh, goodness, William. Writing Omm Sety's Egypt was I think, the high point of my writing career, although I've done a lot of very, very interesting projects.
Yes, you have.
Dr. El-Zany feels that there's more to be told.
I know it. I'm so excited this is coming out. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to stay in touch with him. He's my dear friend and wonderful collaborator, and we'll see if there's more to come. Oh, okay. Also, we do have a website, ommsety.com. And we would invite listeners who had their own Omm Sety experiences of meeting her to email us and let us know, and we'll post some of the most interesting episodes.
Well, once again, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, Catherine. It's been a true pleasure talking with you, and what an incredible story. Just awesome. I hope everyone's going to go out and get a copy of the book and join
I hope so, too. I hope so, too. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome. Thank you. This is William Henry. This is Dreamland. Next up, Linda Moulton Howe.
Emmy Award-winning reporter Linda Moulton Howe has got for us this week an extraordinary report on an Ebola-like virus that is spreading in the Great Lakes and could create a catastrophic situation throughout the whole Mississippi River system. This just never seems to end, one story after another. And one of the ways to keep up with this is Linda's great website, earthfiles.com. Gives you the facts the others dare not. earthfiles.com. Visit it every day for the very latest news about science that others ought to be reporting but do not. Here she is from Albuquerque, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thanks, Whitley. You couldn't have said it better. The threat seemed to be spreading every day in new directions in the environment around us. And what is happening in the Great Lakes with that Ebola-like virus could be potentially, as some scientists have said, a catastrophic event for freshwater fish in the United States. But first, I want to go back to something very important concerning another crisis, and that is the disappearance of honeybees. And the last week of April 2007, media headlines at University of California, San Francisco biochemists had, quote, tracked down suspect in honeybee disappearances, unquote. Their culprit, the news media called it a fungus. But it's not a fungus. It's a one-celled protozoan called Nosema ceranae. The problem with that proposed answer, Nosema ceranae has been identified long before in Spain, other European countries, and the United States in both healthy, normal honeybees, as well as bee bodies found around empty hives where colony collapse disorder has been reported. In CCD, the bees have disappeared in the billions in both the northern and southern hemispheres since the fall of 2006. 5 months ago, in December, scientists in the Colony Collapse Disorder Working Group publicly reported that whatever was causing the massive honeybee disappearances was also severely suppressing honeybee immune systems, leaving the bees vulnerable to all sorts of pathogens, including the Nosema protozoan. The fragility of the honeybee immune system was confirmed by the Genome Project last October, which for the very first time in history mapped all the genes in a honeybee. DNA researchers found that there weren't many genes to deal with poisons or to fight off disease. The conclusion was that honeybees might be especially vulnerable to attacks by pathogens and pesticides and other toxins. The University of Montana's Bee Alert Group recently surveyed more than 500 American beekeepers to find out how many have had bees disappear. The statistic now is 38% of beekeepers have reported hive disappearances as high as 75% of all their bees gone. One bee colony in California went from thriving to complete disappearance in only 2 days. That's why the late April 2007 UC San Francisco announcement that Nosema ceranae was most likely the cause of CCD was surprising and confusing. This week, I asked Jerry Hayes, chief of the apiary section at Florida's Department of Agriculture in Gainesville, Florida, about this Nosema news release.
That was kind of an awkward situation because the CCD working group had already identified Nosema ceranae, which is a one-cell protozoan that lives in honeybees' intestine. The lab in California didn't contact us, but it was good that they did the work because it confirmed what we had already known. But it doesn't seem to be a major player at this time because all the samples that we have taken from all bees seem to have ceranae in them, so it's not something that appears to be a brand new pathogen.
Well, then why did this hit the headlines with that professor seeming to say this is the answer?
Got me, Linda.
Well, I wanted to understand because I thought I had talked with you and Professor Cox Foster and all of these people in the 2 weeks leading up to when you and I had talked.
Right.
And nobody was focusing on Nosema, but I knew that it had come up back in February because they had found it in Spain.
Yeah, and so then there was separate diagnosis of that from the USDA lab in Beltsville probably a month ago, and so this was not something new to us, and then have this kind of blurted out we thought was kind of interesting.
Is there any reason why the San Francisco researchers who put out the information about Nosema possibly being the explanation for the colony collapse disorder, not having checked with the colony collapse disorder scientists before releasing the information?
It certainly seems to be a disconnect in the communication process, and we hope that in the future our other colleagues in other realms and expertises will be able to work more closely with us. These guys kind of charged ahead and identified something we already knew about, and this has been widely identified in Europe and Spain and France for several years. And so there are treatments, there are controls for it, so it's something that beekeepers are addressing already.
Why did the colony collapse disorder science group dismiss nosema as not being the cause for the general disappearances of honeybees?
Because beekeepers were already, in many cases, treating with the antibiotic for nosema in the samples that we took. So some of the samples the beekeepers had been treating and did not have nosema, and some of them they didn't. So it didn't seem to be a connection. CCD appeared whether they were treating or not.
So the idea that the San Francisco researchers released in their announcement that this nosema unicellular protozoa was found in all of the bodies of the bees that they studied, that is misleading.
I think they jumped the gun, yeah.
And it may have been a fluke that the bees that they specifically received for study had it, but it did not represent the universal collection that you all have been studying since the fall.
Well, it's kind of interesting that all the samples that we've taken and all the samples of even healthy colonies all show Nosema ceranae. We can't find the other Nosema apis. So all bees have Nosema ceranae, but yet only some are exhibiting the CCD, and because there's a treatment for it, it seems to be, certainly is a stressor, but it doesn't seem to be the smoking gun that we were looking for.
And the fact that both healthy and colony collapse disorder bees would have nosema fits again into Professor Diana Cox-Foster's hypothesis that this was a symptom of immune collapse.
Yeah, it seems to be a more strong hypothesis as the days go by that something is affecting the bee's immune system, and many of these things we're finding, which are normal pathogens, are proliferating because the bee's immune system cannot handle them.
It sounds as if then that the California researchers had not studied the body of the colony collapse disorder science group's work from December on, and that they made a leap based on a finding as opposed to placing the finding in the context of, let's say, the idea of suppressed immune systems making the bees generally vulnerable to more pathogens?
Yeah, they made a leap. We just need to collaborate more so that we can move ahead and see what we can find.
And as you and I speak on May 2nd, 2007, is it correct that to date there still is not an answer to colony collapse disorder?
No, there's not. And in fact, I'm going down and take a whole other series of bee samples from some commercial beekeepers. And of course, we're getting reports from other parts of the country that they're just now finding it as spring comes, and this is ongoing.
This week, the national program leader for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bee and Pollination Program told Associated Press that if the honeybee collapse continues to worsen, Americans could end up, quote, stuck with grains and water. This is the biggest general threat to our food supply, unquote. Another threat in the American landscape that some microbiologists are calling potentially catastrophic to freshwater fish is a deadly Ebola-like virus known as, quote, viral hemorrhagic septicemia, or VHS. Until 1988, VHS was believed to infect only European freshwater fish, especially rainbow trout exported from the U.S. at the end of the 19th century. But eventually, the virus was confirmed in Asian waters and the Pacific Ocean. Then only 2 years ago, in 2005, to the shock of aquatic specialists, millions of fish died in Lake Ontario in the Great Lakes bleeding from viral hemorrhagic septicemia. And many more Great Lakes fish died last year in 2006, also bleeding. One scientist who has been studying the lethal virus is Jim Winton, Ph.D., and microbiologist and chief of fish health for the U.S. Geological Survey's Western Fisheries Research Center in Seattle. I asked him this week what the size of VHF die-offs have been in the Great Lakes and what the disease symptoms are.
We're talking about thousands of metric tons of some of the species. Some of these die-offs have resulted in dead fish piling up on the beaches in literally 1 or 2 feet deep. We never see all of the fish that die in an outbreak, even in freshwater. But in the marine environment, we hardly see them at all. But if you see 1,000 fish on the beach, there's probably more than 10 times or maybe 50 times that many out in the water someplace. The symptoms of the virus, it attacks fairly quickly, are principally, as the name implies, hemorrhages of the skin and a necrosis or destruction of the internal tissues, mainly the blood-forming tissues of the kidney and spleen, and to some extent the liver as well. And so the virus actually destroys the organ function and tissue function of the fish. They die sometimes of osmotic shock from the destruction of the skin, but more often due to failure of the kidney or other organ systems.
Would the first symptom that we would see on these fish be outright bleeding from the head or the body?
Yes, you would see reddish areas of hemorrhage and lesions on the body of the fish. It's important to say that this virus has no effect on humans. It only affects cold water and cool water fish.
Professor Paul Bowser at Cornell University was quoted as saying, "What's so disturbing is that it's killing fish from so many species and with amazingly high mortality levels."
Yes.
Could you comment on that?
Well, he's exactly right. We are surprised that this virus has such a broad host range. Yeah, we have over 20 species of fish that have produced virus isolates that have been sent to our laboratory for confirmation or identification. Some of them have died in very large numbers, and that's somewhat surprising. In Europe, the virus caused high mortality, but only in a few species. Paul Bowser and others have actually seen the degree of the mortality that occurs, and they've been very impressed by it.
And the fact that the Great Lakes die-offs are affecting at least 20 species, does that reinforce again the question, is there something, a toxin, something else in the Great Lakes water that is suppressing the immune systems of all of these species and making them more vulnerable to this virus?
We don't think so, and that may yet be proven correct. But we have no evidence that this is other than the introduction of a highly virulent mutation of the virus into a population that has never seen it before. And that was true of smallpox with Native Americans. There was no toxin or other things, but people died at very high levels. And influenza and Inuits killed like 100% of the population in some villages. Naive populations have no innate resistance to some introduced pathogens, and it doesn't take a toxin or anything else to make them more susceptible.
Right now we're in beginning May of 2007. What is your greatest fear as the waters start warming up with this summer?
Well, I think we've already seen the beginning of a couple of potential outbreaks. We're awaiting confirmation, but my greatest fear would be that the virus will spread outside of the Great Lakes Basin. My second greatest fear is that it will spread to the remainder of the Great Lakes, not currently known to be in Lake Michigan or Lake Superior. And my third greatest fear is that it will continue to cause high levels of mortality for a fairly long period of time. If the virus leaves the Great Lakes Basin, spreads into aquaculture, it could have very high economic impacts. If it spreads into other parts of the country, it could have very high ecological impacts because the species that are shown to be susceptible in the Great Lakes are widely distributed, and they include things like largemouth and smallmouth bass, which may be present in almost every state in the country.
What is the worst case by the fall of 2007?
Well, the worst case would be that the virus is found to have left the Great Lakes and is spreading down the Mississippi or into other parts of the country where in these wild populations, it's largely uncontrollable. We have very few tools that we can use to actually manage disease in wild populations. We have good diagnostic tools and we have vaccines that can help if the virus were to spread to aquaculture. But even so, it's going to be an increasingly difficult management and economic problem.
This was from USA Today recently by Dennis Kashan.
Yep.
And he was quoting you, and this was the quote: "The VHS virus is the most important and dangerous fish virus known worldwide. Its discovery in our fresh water is disturbing and potentially catastrophic," unquote.
Mm-hmm.
Those are your words, and that's where I've been left with the impression that this could be catastrophic in terms of massive die-offs across these 20 species of fish or more.
Well, I think catastrophic certainly within the context of the Great Lakes ecosystem and the fisheries resources. The word catastrophic refers within certain fisheries resources, and as a fish health problem, it is in fact catastrophic.
And if the impact of the virus in 2007 is in the catastrophic range in the context of the fish populations in the U.S., does that mean that whole species could be nearly wiped out in 2007?
No species is commonly wiped out by an introduced pathogen. The populations will be reduced and eventually will develop some resistance. They may never recover to their former numbers, but they will not be wiped out.
As May unfolds into June with higher temperatures rising in the Great Lakes, is it fair to say that the number of fish die-offs will probably start increasing in a very, very significant way?
I think it will start increasing. We don't know how significant because we don't know what percent of the population has already seen this virus over the last 2 years. If a significant fraction of the existing fish in the Great Lakes have experienced this virus and have some increased resistance to it, the die-offs will not be as large as they were last year. But my feeling is that there are still a very large number of susceptible fish in some parts of the Great Lakes, and I think we'll see the virus causing mortality in some of those populations, and it may be in new parts of the lakes, and it may be in new lakes, and it might be even in new species.
If it gets outside of the Great Lakes, would it be in the states around Michigan, or?
It's hard to know. I mean, the Great Lakes Basin drains a fair number of states in the north-central portion, but there are connections and pathways outside of the Great Lakes into the Mississippi drainage.
And so if it gets into the Mississippi River, then it spreads throughout that whole Mississippi River drainage all the way down to New Orleans, correct?
Potentially.
And then what exponentially is the problem that you all face in trying to deal with it?
Well, obviously, it's easier to contain a virus to a given watershed, even as large as the Great Lakes, than it would be to try to contain it if it starts spreading to significant portions of the United States. So we're actually quite worried about this virus spreading outside of the Great Lakes, whether it's into the Mississippi or across the Rocky Mountains. And should that happen, then the problem will be magnified considerably.
And are we talking then about millions and millions of fish die-offs throughout the Mississippi drainage?
Well, it's hard to put any kind of numbers to that. I mean, this is something we have very little past experience. This is almost certainly the largest example of a natural outbreak in multiple species of aquatic animals like fish that any of us have ever experienced. And so we don't have a lot to go on. I think we have a long ways to go before we know how this is going to play out.
What can be done to contain or eliminate VHS from American freshwater fish from the Great Lakes down to the Mississippi, across the Rocky Mountains, and throughout the more than 20 species that have been affected in the Great Lakes and decimated by this Ebola-like virus that causes bleeding and death rapidly? Well, right now, on an emergency basis, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Canadian government, and states in the Great Lakes region are enacting regulations to stop people from transporting potentially infected fish from regions of the Great Lakes that have had these big die-offs, and to keep the transportation out of what they think are still clean waters. As Dr. Winton said, if the lethal hemorrhagic virus spreads outside the Great Lakes into river systems such as the Mississippi, it will be catastrophic for freshwater fish and their related ecosystems in the United States. So, Whitley, there are at least 2 environmental emergencies now in America that could directly impact our food supply. Honeybees that are massively disappearing and not pollinating crops, and the Ebola-like virus that could decimate more than 20 species of freshwater fish.
Linda, when will it end? When we end, or are we going to get a handle on all of this? What is your sense of this?
I've asked that question to every scientist that I have talked to, and a lot of them say, I don't want to sound like an alarmist, so they'll talk to me off the record, and basically the consensus is, we are at a time in which it's very clear that Earth life, from whether it is the honeybees, the amphibians, the reptiles, the sharks in the ocean, the polar bears in the Arctic, and on, that we are seeing collapses of species in a variety of ways now all over the Earth. And if part of this issue with the honeybees is related directly to the amount of pesticides that are now being mixed out in the general environment, combined with the spread of asphalt in buildings and a declining, a very, very reduced biodiversity place for animals to go, like the ice is melting underneath the feet of the polar bears. The honeybees and the pollinators are losing the ground that they've had for centuries and millennia. And therefore, humans stand at what a lot of people now are calling a tipping point, which is we are becoming conscious that all around us, life that we have taken for granted, the honeybees being the most outstanding because it uniquely adapted itself to North American crops. It is the honeybee that we have depended upon, we have taken for granted, and all of a sudden, so as one biologist said this past weekend on the news, we have hung our food supply on one fragile thread, the honeybee. And in a very, very direct and immediate way, the honeybee and what's happening there becomes this metaphor for everything else, for the spread of this horrible virus now in the Great Lakes that could decimate our freshwater fish, and that underneath it all is that humans, scientists, have not been aware of all of the links that could bring this kind of emergency, like the perfect storm, all colliding in the summer of 2007 on so many levels, that really says we are disconnected from the environment around us. We have taken it for granted that it will hang in there with us.
Thank you very much. We have run out of time.
Hattie and I became good friends. We corresponded for a number of years about questions of ancient Egypt, questions I had. I'm a writer, and I was working on a time travel novel back to ancient Egypt, so I was really keen to know what I could. And Hattie was quite an accomplished amateur Egyptologist, with a great number of friends who were the famous names that we read about in Egyptology. So I guess that's maybe a few more words than you needed to hear, but that's how I met him.
No, that's great. And because what I want to get into just in the couple moments we have here before the break is establishing for our listeners a little bit of a timeline, Catherine. At age 3, Dorothy fell down the stairs and was knocked unconscious. What happened after this pivotal moment?
She appeared to die. The doctor was called for. He pronounced her dead after an examination, and he went back to his office to prepare the death certificate. When he returned about an hour later, he found a little girl who had some bruises on her, but she was bouncing in her bed, and she was saying, "I want to go home now." And she wasn't talking about her London apartment. She was talking about new images, new memories that had suddenly come into her little head. She didn't know how to describe them because she was only 3 and she had never seen a temple. But that's what was in her mind. And a year later, her parents took her to the British Museum. And as soon as they walked into the Egyptian galleries, the little girl, Dorothy, just fell apart. She ran around hugging all the statues, and her parents were terribly embarrassed because the child was making a scene, and this was not the kind of place where you make a scene.
Was also the co-producer of the exhibit Continuum, the Immortality Principle, and historian for the Alexandria Project, a search for the tomb of Alexander the Great and the lost Alexandrian Library. Catherine is a member of the American Research Center in Egypt and the Egyptian Exploration Organization and is a sponsor of the Amarna Royal Tombs Project in the Valley of the Kings. Catherine Dees, welcome to Dreamland.
Thank you. I'm just delighted to be here and speak about Omm Sety.
Well, I can't remember the last time I was so fired up about a book. I read it, and I've lost 2 days at the Vanderbilt University Divinity Library in their Egypt section. Just got to go back there and feel that vibe of Abydos. You brought it to life so incredibly well.
You're very kind. I felt almost as if I were in another realm as I was working with the manuscript.
It's mesmerizing, just the all of the story elements, but when it's put together the way you did, it just is such a wonderful read, and I highly encourage everybody to get a hold of this book. Let's first, for a moment, if you wouldn't mind, about your collaborator, Hani El-Zani. Tell us about Hani and how you came to collaborate with him on this project.
Well, Hani, I really hesitate to call him Dr. El-Zani, which is his proper name. He's a very comfortable gentleman. So we'll call him Hani for the interview.
Okay.
He was an industrial chemist, and he was named president of the Egyptian Sugar and Distillery Company in 1956, which was the largest on the African continent. The company had been previously owned by a consortium of European countries until Nasser nationalized Egypt's major industries. So Hani was the first native Egyptian to head one of the greatest industries in all of Egypt. So a quite competent man, a scientist, a person who looks at things with a cool eye, and a man of huge responsibilities. The headquarters.
We're going to explore the astounding story of Dorothy Eady, an Englishwoman who believed she had a previous life in the 13th century BC. She had been a girl who had been left to be raised at the Temple of Seti at Abydos in Egypt when she was 3 years old by her soldier father, her mother having died. At 14, she became a vowed priestess of Isis and first encountered the powerful warrior pharaoh Seti I in the garden of his newly built temple. The pharaoh from a ruling family and the off-limits virgin priestess fell tragically in love. When she discovered she was pregnant, rather than reveal her secret, she committed suicide. Seti was devastated. 3,300 years later, Seti found his temple priestess. She was in a child named Dorothy Eady living in the early 20th century England. Soon, Seti would take her through the mist, star-walking along the astral highway to Amenti, the hidden realm, where she encountered him not as a phantom, but as a man. Their love affair resumed. When they weren't making love, they were talking about ancient Egypt. As an adult, Dorothy moved to Egypt, becoming an accomplished and widely acknowledged scholar known for an uncanny knowledge of ancient Abydos. She was given the name Omm Sety. When the search for Omm Sety, a story of eternal love, was first told in 1987 by Jonathan Cott in collaboration with Dr. Hani El-Zani, Omm Sety's long-term friend, it received high praise from everyone from Yoko Ono to Carl Sagan. The book acknowledges Jackie Onassis as one of its editorial guardian spirits. It brought up intriguing mysteries of magic, perception, memory, and reincarnation. And in the intervening years, there's been talk of secret diaries of Omm Sety, of lost knowledge about Abydos not revealed in Jonathan Cott's book. Today, those revelations have been masterfully presented in Omm Sety's Egypt by Catherine Dees in collaboration with Hani Elzani. Catherine is a California writer and editor with an abiding love for Egypt and its brilliant, still unfolding legacy. A longtime student of human consciousness and the lost history and wisdom of the ancient world, she
travel and all the things that her story involves. And the hostess made a beeline for me that evening and said, "There's someone you must meet." I hadn't told her a thing about my interest in Omm Sety. She brought me to Dr. Elzani and said, "I think you two have a lot to talk about." Just one of those aha moments. So here I was, talking with the man who had collaborated with Jonathan Cott on that first book. And we ended up having dinner together, and we were sitting at a table with a group of Egyptologists talking about Omm Sety. And they said that they would take Omm Sety's word for where something could be found underneath the sands over any mechanical probes out there. The Japanese had just been doing some work in the Great Pyramid looking for hidden chambers, and they had brought the state-of-the-art machines. And at that time, I don't think they found anything. So everybody was wishing that Omm Sety had been around because she would probably be able to see just what was there. The next day, I was invited to have tea with the Elzanis. I went to their apartment in Cairo, and one of the highlights, the electrifying moments of that interview was when he put on a tape recorder, a recording of a conversation he had with his old friend years earlier. And I heard this vivid, British, confident voice saying, "I know where the tomb of Nefertiti lies, and someday I'll tell you before I die." And then he turned the tape off. And I said, "Did she tell you? Did she ever tell you?" And he said, "Oh, yes, that and much more."
Wow.
Well, I was hooked. Of the company happened to be at Nag Hammadi, which was just a hop and a skip away from Abydos. And over Hani's life, he had been fascinated by the history of Egypt, and he had hung out as a child at the excavations wherever he found them. So when he found himself close to Abydos, it was almost like a dream come true because he knew about some of the great ruins there, especially the Temple of Seti. And one day, shortly after he set up shop in Nag Hammadi as the president of this enormous conglomerate, he took a little breather and went over to Abydos, and there he encountered the most unusual woman he had ever met, a blonde, outspoken, clever English woman who apparently was living a life as a peasant woman in the village of Abydos. Everything about her was strange. But the most marvelous thing, the thing that brought the two of them together, was her great knowledge of ancient Egypt and of the temple. Knowledge that went so far beyond what could be known at the time. She seemed to have a direct line to the past. The two of them became fast friends. Now that's how they met. They became friends, and he became her confidant and, in a way, her protector for the next 25 years that she lived. I met him at a dinner party in Cairo years later, right after Jonathan Cott's book, The Search for Omm Sety, had come out. I had read the book and was absolutely charmed by this love story, and just the whole possibility of reincarnation and out-of-body travel.